3, 2.
Shalom, family. I'm Gamariel Ben Yehuda. I'm the guest host today on Spiritual Alternatives, and I'm the guest host today because I'm sitting in to interview the resident host, who is Prince Asiel Ben Israel, the ambassador and the chief, international chief of the aspirations, hopes, and dreams of the African people, wherever they may have been found. We actually want to talk about an article, an interview that he did, and this is approximately the 40-year anniversary of the interview that he did in a publication that's called Black World. And we don't want to waste any time. We want to get right to it. So we'll go back into that and we'll welcome Prince Asiel Ben Israel. How are you?
It's my pleasure.
Excellent.
My pleasure, Brother Gamariel.
And we also have his son, who is sitting in for the interview, which is Yosef Ben Asiel.
How you doing? It's a pleasure and honor to be amongst of wonderful, great men that's fighting for our righteousness and our freedom on this planet.
Excellent. Okay. The interview, which was to give you an idea about the interview itself. At that particular time, there was a gentleman by the name of E. Hoyt Fuller who conducted the interview. 1975 is a time of tremendous turmoil for the African Hebrew Israelites in particular, and there were a lot of articles that were being printed, and this was an opportunity that our brother Mr. Fuller took to give the Prince an opportunity to speak on behalf of the Hebrew Israelite community from their perspective. So Prince, first thing I want to ask you, what recollections you might have in general before we go in depth?
Well, this interview came about because when I was in school in America, I became part of an organization called Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. And the men who were publishing Ebony and Jet were both members of that fraternity, John H. Johnson, and those men were the men in the publishing field at that time that was having a major impact on America. And one of the brothers told me that he wanted me to meet Mr. Johnson to tell my story because it was a fascinating one about us leaving America and returning back to Africa on our own volition. So he thought it would be a tremendous opportunity to get the story out. But I was warned before I met with Mr. Johnson that he never spoke to anybody longer than 10 minutes. And this gave me the opportunity, when talking to Bob Johnson, who was the publisher of Jet at the time, that I was to not be offended if Mr. Johnson abruptly stopped the meeting after 5 or 10 minutes. That interview lasted more than an hour with him. And at the end of it, he said, "You're going to do exactly what you say you're going to do." He said, "Because I heard a spirit coming out of you that you were determined that what you told me was real, and I believe it." So I remember that because during those days, John H. Johnson was a man of importance, a man of respect, a man of great accomplishments, who started small with a $500 loan from his mother and put together this giant publishing operation in America representing African Americans. But he also knew that the business of publishing was a profit business. And so therefore, he couldn't only speak to black people, he had to speak to those advertisers who were underwriting his publications. And so I was a very controversial person. We were dealing with some very sensitive issues that affected the Jewish community in America and the world. And so people were treading very lightly on whether or not I was some kind of extremist or some kind of radical person talking about blacks were descendants of the biblical Israelites, when everybody, quote, at that time in the world knew that all the Israelites were white. And here I'm talking about they're black, they're African, and that Israel was in Africa, unheard of. And they wanted to know, well, who is this young guy saying these bold and daring things? And so I had to first meet with Mr. Johnson and convince him that I wasn't foolish, stupid, crazy, or just some kind of crackpot coming up with some idea to put on the minds of black Americans. He wasn't going to be a vehicle for stupidity or exploitation of his publication. And after hearing me, he was convinced that it was a story worthy that he was willing to publish. He had a magazine called Black World at that time that dealt particularly with African issues and African American issues beyond the media of Ebony and Jet. And so I was one of the last interviews that this publication did. And I felt honored and to remind me of the 40th anniversary of this interview, which was May 1975 in downtown Chicago. So thank you, Brother Gamariel, for reminding me of what I did over 40 years ago.
Okay. My pleasure. So I'm reminding you, but for many of the viewers, they may have no idea. So we wanted to take an opportunity to take someone who has been in the room, in the conversation, and in the strategy room. So first setting the context, 1975. What is it looking like? We're talking 10 years after the assassination of Malcolm X. We're talking of 7 years from the assassination of Dr. King. The exodus
Right.
of the African Hebrew Israelites going into Liberia
10 years.
and whatever state they may have been in 1975.
Right.
But also talking about I mentioned them because I want people to understand Prince Asiel in a lineage
Right.
or progression
Right.
of freedom fighters.
Right.
People who wake up every day talking, they wake up with freedom on their mind.
Right.
So can you speak to that in terms of how you view the spirit of Prince Asiel, and also at that same opportunity, set the stage for what were some of the concerns, what were some of the events that were pressing on you and your team in 1975?
That's a great question. When I look back and go back, I remember that I was this young upcoming businessman in Chicago that was angered by the pressure and the pain of our people. There were the civil rights demonstration, the dogs, the beatings, the jailings, the assassinations of strong black men and women, the discrediting of them, the Chicago riots of the '68 convention, Democratic convention, where hundreds were gassed and beaten and arrested. There was the mayor of Chicago, Richard J. Daley, who gave the order shoot to kill in Chicago when there were riots because of the pain of black people that suffered from the murder, assassination of Martin Luther King. There was an air of hopelessness and helplessness that every time we stood up to be free, someone made sure that they would destroy that spokesperson or spokespersons who was leading those charges. And there was a lot of pain, and so we in the Hebrew community had thought we had escaped that pain by leaving out of America, returning back to Africa, and began to start a new life, only to find out that we were in the jungles of West Africa, living in tents, fighting malaria, driver ants by the millions. The green and black mamba snake was the most poisonous snakes in the world. And we realized becoming free was not a picnic or a celebration of joy, but very painful. We had to deliver our own children, educate our own children in tents in the open skies. There was no indoor plumbing. There was no indoor facilities for cooking. We were cooking over open fires, so we were almost thrust back to the Stone Age, coming out of a modern society like America, and particularly a modern city like Chicago. So there were all kind of conflicts in our thinking. We didn't know if we could make it. And the majority of the people returned back to America, 2/3 of them. But just like it was predicted, a third of us survived it and continued on to the journey that was destined to take us, as Dr. King saw in the day before he was murdered, that God had allowed him to go to the mountaintop and look over and see the promised land. He said, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. Well, that was in April of '68, but in May of '68, we landed in Israel. Prince Keskiahu and Prince Ben-Ami. For the first time in 2,000 years, we fulfilled Dr. King's vision, but also we fulfilled the prophecies that Abraham had seen, that's listed in the 15th chapter of Genesis, that we would return from the land of our captivity back to our land with great substance. And we at that time defined the great substance as that we had our right mind back, and that we now could clearly see what happened to us as a people.
Some of the things that you touched upon, you talked about the burdens of freedom in Liberia, but you also touched upon the timetables that we're talking about. And as I looked at the article, and you, in reviewing the article, back then you spoke prominently about the vision that was given to our father Abraham, Genesis 15:12.
Right.
So as we're having this conversation, we want to speak in terms of those timelines, the prophetic timeline overall, the historical timeline, particularly as it pertains to African people in Africa, but also separating, if we can, one group of African peoples, the Israelites. Okay, so in reading the article, one of the things that came through very clearly was the idea of the power to define. In that season, we were defining ourselves and all of those types of things. He asked you, how did you become an Israelite? What was your background? Were you born an Israelite? What was your background coming into that?
It reminds me of the story of Moses. Moses was an Israelite, but because of the oppression in the land of his birth, his mother caused him to escape by hiding him, and knowing that the Pharaoh's daughter of Egypt go and bathe in a particular spot. And so she had the midwife put the baby near her where she would find him. But Moses grew up an Egyptian, and there was a time in his growth and development that the spirit in him caused them to identify with the suffering of the people that he was ruling over. And it became apparent that there was a synergy between him and those people that were suffering. Well, I remember in pledging the fraternity, one of the songs that was played or sung during the time of our going through this process to become part of this organization was "Go Down Moses, Tell O Pharaoh, Let My People Go." And I can remember as if it was yesterday the feeling that I had when I heard that song. It was as if they were singing directly to me. So like Moses, being born a Hebrew but raised an Egyptian, I was born a black American in America, but there was times that I knew I was not part of a history that did not lead back to a God and to a great nation and to a destiny in the future that would make me become part of one of the greatest movements in the earth.
So, Yosef, what I want to do, because you're following this conversation,
Yes, sir.
you know this conversation, so as I'm speaking with your father,
Yes, sir.
if there's something that I'm inviting you to
Absolutely.
chime in with questions and that type of thing before we get to your segment.
Okay, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. The timeline.
Okay.
Speaking prophetically, speaking historically in terms of world history as it pertains to Africa in the 400-year, as a result of the great transatlantic slave trade, and Israelite history.
Well, one of the things I want to remind people that during my whole growing up in America, the only number I used to hear all the time is people say we've been here 400 years, 400 years, 400 years. But I didn't know if that had any connection. And then when I discovered the Old Testament, which was what our people did not read because they told us growing up that it had been fulfilled by the coming of the modern day Christianity or the coming of the Eurocentric Jesus. And so most of us didn't read the Old Testament, and if we did, it had no connection to us because we had been taught through movies and through writings that the people of ancient world were all white people. And no one ever showed an African as an ancient. From time to time, you would hear about Ethiopia having the great empires, and then when you got a little older, you heard about Mali and Timbuktu, these great centers of learning in Africa, but you never saw any connection between you and those ancient empires.
Now that's controversial.
Of course.
In 75,
Right.
on a scale of 1 to 10, how controversial would you say?
11. It was off the scale because here we're fighting racism in America who are refusing to give black people the right to even be called black. Just calling yourself black created riots across America. We were told that we were Negroes and that we were 3/5 of a person when America started in terms of our human beingness. Because the Constitution started off with all men are created equal, except Negroes, they are 3/5 of a person, and only using that numerical number as a designation for the slave master having the right to count us as 3/5 so that he could have more power to vote. That was a sign of his wealth, not of a sign of our humanity. So it was very controversial to talk about the God of the Bible being a black man and the mother of the Messiah being a black woman, because black women were either cooks, maids, mammies, all of the degrading kind of titles and positions that this inhumane world called America could do to a people of greatness. So very, very controversial. But the other thing that was taking place at that time is that there was a rumbling among the youth in America, and Martin Luther King was one of those youth who had just finished his PhD, had become a graduate student, but was also a very spiritual man. And most people in those days didn't think of men as being spiritual. They thought of them being religious. And so religiosity became the dominant theme rather than spirituality. And so there was no way to discern who was who, because when you said God, that meant you was religious.
Okay, I want to jump in there. So you go from being a Christian born by the name Warren Brown
Right.
to being part of the Hebrew Israelite religion.
Well, I didn't ever call it a religion.
So what do we call that?
We call it going back to your culture, your land, your language, and your culture. Hebrewism was a nationality to me. It was not a religion, because now I recognize that all of the biblical patriarchs were Hebrews, and it meant one who has crossed over or ascended.
All of the biblical patriarchs.
All of them.
Abraham, the
Isaac,
prophets,
Jacob, the prophet,
Gideon,
all of them.
Yeshua,
Samson,
all of them.
David,
Hebrews.
Hebrews,
Okay.
and not just Hebrews, black Hebrews. And we were only saying black because we were talking about two races in the world at that time, black and white. So if you wasn't white, you were black. And that was just the reality of that day. But when we began to understand Africa, we began to reconnect to our African roots. So we were no longer black Hebrews, we became the African Hebrews. We didn't just become African Hebrews, we became the original African Hebrews. It's pretty much like Rome was the land of the Romans, and the Roman Church morphed into the Catholic Church, but you didn't have to be a Roman to be a Catholic. There are Irish Catholics, there are Italian Catholics, there are German Catholics, and soon it became the universal. See, Africa had a God too, but because the Hebrew people were the people reflecting and teaching the world about this God, they themselves got lost in the destruction, as Chancellor Williams wrote about, of the black civilizations. And when we no longer knew that these black civilizations were a spiritual-based, shamanistic people who had these magical powers that could part a Red Sea, or that could take the heat out of fire in the fiery furnace, or the appetite from a hungry lion, as Daniel in the lion's den, or stop the sun or the moon, we forgot that we had those powers. And then the world started calling those people who had that black magic. They didn't associate it with black people, they just associated it with darkness and something evil. But if we really understood that those men and women in African American society that developed blood plasma, that performed the first open heart surgery, they were remnants of this great power given by this great creator to us as a people to prove that he was still with us. Du Bois, who went to Harvard after going to Germany to get a PhD and coming back to Harvard to get one. Or George Washington Carver, who said in his biography that God permitted the plants to talk to him, and he found their secrets by listening to them tell him what was in them. All of this sounded spooky and crazy, but that was the nature of black people in America, who were the remnants of this great spiritual people whose God was their presence. Upon our research, we realized there was a German Hebrew philosopher by the name of Oscar Goldberg, who wrote a book in 1925 talking about the essence of the biogenetic God, the God of Israel, of the Israelite people, of the Hebrew people. So we were putting the pieces back together. Once we got to Israel, we received correspondence from all over the world to say, you are fulfilling the prophecies that men spoke about hundreds of years before y'all even got there, while you were still in slavery. Men predicted, who had studied the history of God's people, that when you saw black people leaving America, returning back to the promised land, it would be the beginning of the Messianic age.
You mentioned prophecy.
Yes, sir.
So we got to talk about the Bible, but I don't want to get to that yet. Let's talk about this geography, because you mentioned George Washington Carver, W.E.B. Du Bois. Those are what we would call today African Americans.
Right.
So we're talking Israel sitting on the Mediterranean Sea in the Middle East. You mentioned Moses in Egypt. Geographically, how do we make that connection between Israel, Africa, and now you saying that all of the prominent African Americans were somehow connected with that?
Well, that's a great question, because what you have to do is begin to go back to Carter G. Woodson when he wrote in his premier work, The Miseducation of the Negro. We purposely were mistaught, misled, misguided, so that we would not find our way back when we begin to look at what you just identified as the Bible. And Bible simply means book. The book was a book of the people of God and the nations and the lands connected to them and being affected by them, or how they affected them. Them meaning the Hebrew people. Now, when you begin to look at a map, the map was distorted to make America look huge and Africa look small. But in reality, the land mass of the United States of America can fit into Africa 3.5 times. Africa is a land mass of 15.5 million square miles. America is only 3.5 million. But we didn't know that growing up. We thought America was this giant place.
Let me interrupt you, because you keep saying Africa.
Well, Africa is a name, some say, that was given to that land by a Roman general called Leo Africanus. But in fact, further research has revealed that it is a Hebrew word that comes from Afra, from the tribe of Ephraim, who had been scattered, what was called the northern 10 tribes, into that part of northeast, for the sake of history, Africa. Nations like Morocco, Sudan, Libya, all of these were people of color. Let me put it that way first, dark skin color. And when you begin to realize that they were the direct descendants of Noah, when you look in the bibliography of Noah's descendants, he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Well, Ham, one of his sons, had 4 sons, Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, Put, which is Libya, Canaan, which is modern-day Israel, and Cush, which is Ethiopia. All of those nations are, quote, African people, to use that old word. But when we further researched, we found out that the land they called Africa and the Asia Minor was really called the Garden of Eden. Because when you go to that book called the Bible, you'll find that the boundaries identifying where the Garden of Eden was 4 rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon, the blue and the white Nile, and bordered by the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is at the north, modern-day Iraq and Iran, in that area. So from modern-day Iraq and Iran all the way down to Uganda, where the source of the Nile begins in Uganda, because I went there to see for myself in a town called Jinja, Uganda, the source of the Nile begins, and it flows up, so that we now know that the migration was always up the Nile, not down the Nile. So when we begin to put these pieces of the puzzle together, we were shocked. And I recently interviewed a Speaker of the House from Uganda, and I asked them, what is the Nile River in the native language? What is it called? They say the River of the Gods. And when I began to get these pieces historically and began to connected what we had, the puzzle started taking shape. And then I could begin to identify why the black man and the black woman in America is so powerful and so feared and hated, because the satanic or the negative forces did not want the power of the people of God to come back in and bring justice and truth and mercy back on this planet.
So some of the topics that you've touched upon so far, we end up brushing up against geography, politics, religion, I mean, all of these pretty much, well, religion and politics pretty much taboo. Can't talk about them. But with the geography, does it matter what we call a place? Because names change all the time.
It doesn't once you break it down to its lowest common denominator. You can call, you can name anything you want in the name. Well, what was its original intent? You can call the God a Negro. But when he does these unusual things, you can't connect that with negative growth, which is what Negro was supposed to mean. That this human being had a negative growth, not a positive growth. But when that positive growth individual, who had been identified as a negative growth, comes into his own, he won't remain a Negro. So I couldn't remain Warren Brown, the former African in America. I became Prince Asiel, the resurrected spirit from the land of the gods and the kings and the princes. So I was back to my natural self, and it was just a matter of time before I would return back to my land, my language, and my culture.
Power to define.
Yes.
In an individual.
Yes.
What about a nation?
Well,
like the name Israel.
First of all, it doesn't take but two people to begin a nation, a man and a woman, and then their progenitors, just like we see in Noah starting the new world. He had his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. So 8 people is given credit for this modern world that we now currently live in, which is 7 billion people that started off with, quote, 8 people. Now, without discussing the validity of all of that, we use that as a premise to argue the point that you made. Israel, when we began to look at the root of it, the etymology of it, we realize that Israel means he that has power with God and with man, because that was the name that Jacob's name was changed to from Jacob, the supplanter, to Israel.
Now this is what the name actually itself, Israel, means.
Yes.
It means
he that has power with the creator of the heavens and earth and with man. And that was the power that is being restored back to our people.
Is there anything, so in changing the name?
It must be important, because what you call a person or a thing is, when you break it down, you find the essence of that thing that it was created out of or created for in the thing. And so you cannot call a dog a human being, because a human being is defined as one with a soul and a spirit and the ability to create. So you can't you can call him a dog because he has low behavior traits and habits. But when he has those higher traits and habits, you got to call him what he really is, a God.
I think this will be the last question I ask on this subject of geography. So I'm recalling some maps that I've seen where they show Africa, but they only show sub-Saharan Africa as Africa. So all of those countries that you mentioned, like Libya, like Egypt, coming across Morocco, so forth, and the Middle East, they call it, not being part of Africa.
Well, the Middle East is a political term that was developed during World War II by British war correspondents to identify that part of the world. It's not an actual place. The Middle East of what? What is it east of? Nobody never raises that question and asks, what is the Middle East? East of what? You got to be east of something to be in the middle of it. So when you're talking about geography, you got to know what's the starting point. When they go back hundreds of thousands of years, they talk about the migration out of Africa into all parts of the earth called the world. But they never say life came out of Europe into Africa. They always say life came out of Africa into Europe, into Asia, and into any other place on the planet. And that can be verified by archaeology,
Science
by
supports it.
science, and by geology. So we're not just making up that black people are the foundation of the earth. Science, geography, history, and archaeology proves it.
Now going back to the Bible, as you relating to it as a history book that is the compass guiding your steps and your moves through Liberia, going back into the Holy Land. Would you speak in terms of 40 years ago, 1975, what were the conditions within the community that you faced there around that time? What was the nature of the relationship with the Israeli people first, or maybe the Israeli government, whichever you choose to touch upon first, but give us an idea of the context in Israel 40 years ago.
Well, first of all, when we showed up in 1969, 68, 69, and said we were descendants of that land, you got to remember that in 1948, the United Nations had decided to give a land to some people based on their religious faith. They were called Jewish. And the Jewish people had made themselves be descendants of the biblical Israelites. Now, that's when things get a little politically and historically complicated, because you're right about the power defined. Who writes the history is
to the victor. To the victor goes the spoils.
It's just that simple. So the European world had decided that after they came out of their dark ages, they had a period of enlightenment. They knew that they had to rewrite history in order to reflect them now as the original people of the lands on the planet, and that everything that existed before has now been rewritten to give credit to them. So even though we found pyramids in Mexico and in other places on the planet, no one ever said they were going to give the black people who built the pyramids in Egypt credit for traveling the waterways of the earth and building those great empires in other parts of the world. They rather said some aliens came down in rocket ships and helped them build the pyramids, which is the whole theory behind Hitler becoming the supreme race, saying that the Aryan race had help from those from outer space to make them great and taught them. When in fact, those were the black gods that had ascended on the planet to uplift humanity. But because there's always been a challenge between good and evil, evil transformed itself to being that other than African, and black became evil. So
Power to define.
Power to define. So here again, all of this is part of the unraveling of the puzzle that have brought the earth and the planet to what it is today.
We still want to talk about the conditions and the give and take in Israel, but before we do that, talk about the psychology of the things that you're saying that are in black and white terms. Is this coming out of some type of resentment for the 400 years and all of that? Because there's some pretty crazy ideas about how we come to be some type of, I mean, Hitler had the idea of a master race, so it could seem disingenuous that, well, black people, we the greatest of everything, and you hear these types of things. Where is that coming from? Where are we getting that idea?
Let's go back to what you said earlier, science. The genetic science validates that the African gene is the dominant gene, that the white gene is recessive. This is not me saying that, this is science. This is a fact, verifiable.
Okay.
That Black genes are dominant and white genes are recessive. So when we begin to look at the dominion of the earth, we go to the earliest stages of anthropology, archaeology, and find out where did the migration from where start. And it didn't start in cold Europe, where nothing was growing. The Ice Age, Africa never experienced an Ice Age. It has never been an Ice Age, but Europe experienced the Ice Age. So we know what nothing growing there, so it couldn't have come out of there. We knew that growth has always been there, and there's been no Ice Age in Africa or the Isles of the Sea, but all of these things go back to verifying where life started. And when you begin to look at it, you begin to say it makes sense. For instance, when we went there, you want to know the condition of the people. The world didn't even conceive that black people could be the people descended directly from the gods. So it wasn't not even a thought, because in their constitution in America, they said we were less than human. And so when they declared that all men were created created equal, but blacks were 3/5 of a person, we knew something was wrong. There was a dichotomy that existed and a contradiction about truth and a lie. Now, somebody had to know the truth in order for somebody to create a lie. And somebody had to know the lie in order to want it to live greater than the truth. Because God says, I'll write it in your heart, your inward parts. And when we know that the heart is the first organ to develop in the fetus, we know that if God had programmed something, it would program it in that heart brain, because science has discovered that the body has two brains, one in the head, one in the heart. We identify the head brain as logical. Things got to be logical. But the heart brain is based on spirit or emotion, as people later begin to agree. And whenever people said, oh, you too soft-hearted, that means you got a feeling. And when you are indifferent to people, they say, oh, he's so cold-hearted. Well, African people have never been that. Language is everything, too. It defines your reality. The power to define that reality is in the mouth, in the tongue. You can either bless somebody with your mouth or do what? Curse somebody with your mouth. And so the words I speak, God said, they are spirit and they are what? Life. So I'm saying, I'm speaking to those listening to resurrect their mind and activate that dominant gene in them that means towards truth, to begin to work again. You said start. I'm starting their heart brain to think again so that they can see what happened to them, because they just been asleep. See, death has been described as a sleep. You're not active doing anything. When you sleep, you're not breathing. You're just not doing. We've been asleep. We've been lost.
Like in a coma.
That's exactly what it is. We've been in a spiritual prophetic coma for the last 2,000 years. When you read the 83rd Psalms that says, come, let us cut them off from being a people, that the name of Israel is no longer in their mind. That mind was the brain that would activate you to your past and to your creative source. If you know the source of your life, you don't die. You continue to renew it. That's why the man made out of the earth could never die, because you were supposed to be vegans. You would constantly be eating yourself into health.
Right, replenishing.
Replenishing yourself. That's why we say food is medicine. Not dead animals are medicine to make you well. Death cannot bring about life. That's why evil, E-V-I-L, you turn it around, it spells live, L-I-V-E. So all our people
So
got
if you
to
go
do,
in the opposite
you
direction,
go in the opposite direction, you die. If you turn it
And
back
it's evil.
around, you go back and you live.
there's a...
Man, just
Please,
to-
please.
not to interrupt the progression of your questions, but I think staying in the line of psychology, listening to you speak, I think is so relevant because our generation, I think it's one of the major things that we suffer from.
What is your generation?
Our generation, my generation, what I like to say is anywhere between the ages 18 to 35. That's the
Okay.
demographic which I'm speaking about right now when I say my generation. And our psychology has been one of our greatest detriments. But listening to you speak and even going back to...
Describe the psychology that you're speaking of.
Absolutely. And the reason I say our psychology has been our detriment because we have a psyche that is connected to death. It's a psyche that's not connected to progression in life and having forwardness and the ability to create on our own. And we've been subjugated to a mentality that always has been dependent on somebody else to create for us and to provide for us. And listening to the Prince, and even back there in 1975, I think his psyche or his psychology in which he approached things was one of the things that propelled him as the next generation of leadership. So, and I guess the two-part of my question is, can you explain to me and my generation how that, even though facing all these different oppositions, all these different obstacles, seeing men that came before you were doing the great things that they were doing, like we mentioned before, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Fred Hampton, all these great men, Elijah Muhammad, either being incarcerated or being assassinated or other number of different discrepancies that they're facing in life. What allowed you to continue and to persevere through those times and seeing everybody kind of come before you, not fully accomplish the greatness of what you knew you had to embark on in your journey?
Well, that's a great question. And I had to ask myself that question when I first decided that I was going to look into this. How far was I willing to look into the whole idea of what I was thinking? Would I be discouraged? Would I be troubled by what I found? So what I did is I looked at the continuity of all of those men that had preceded me and saw what was missing. And what was missing was the power to define for themselves. They were still trying to define themselves within the reality of their captors or their masters.
People who hated.
People that hated them. And when I discovered that they hated us, now hate don't mean mistreating you. Hate simply means that envy and jealousy of who you are. Remember, Joseph's brother hated him, not because he did something to them. He was favored by the father for being a son that pleased his father. That was the only reason they hated him, and because of it, he was rewarded by his father with affection, love, and blessings.
Just being who he was.
That's all he was just being. They was trying to be what they thought they wanted to be rather than what they were being taught to be. And it's the same thing with me. I decided not to be what I was being taught to be, but what God was instructing to me. So when I heard the voice said, leave America, I left America. When I heard the voice say, you're no longer a colored man, but you're a Hebrew, I heard the voice. And called myself a Hebrew. When I heard that I was no longer a Negro, but a prince, I identified as a prince. So when I began to be obedient to those little steps, I continued to see the growth by following that path on wherever it was going to lead me to. That's why I can sit here today after 50 years and say it works. And I'm passing the mantle on to you saying, continue the journey. You're going to reach difficult points, but you persevere. Continue to serve the creative source that has breathed the breath of life into your body to cause you. And as you trust that, Your mind is going to open up to the secrets of the universe to get the power back that you were lost when you were anesthetized and put to sleep.
That's it. Prince, I hear you talking about inspiration.
Yes.
Okay. As a young man, you were 33 years old at the time.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now, you inspire a lot of people with what you do,
Okay.
and saying the types of things that you said. Okay. And I want to mention that the interview itself is going to be made available so
Yes.
that people can actually purchase a copy, and then they can also get this video. But in terms of inspiration and the people that you inspire, who were some of the specific people who inspired you, who you drew strength and inspiration from?
Well, I got to go back to the woman that gave birth to me. That's why the veneration of the spiritual woman is so important. That's why I understood when they began to deify, the Catholic Church began to deify the mother of Jesus, of Yeshua, because she trusted God to impregnate in her a seed in her mind that she had a special child that was going to be destined for greatness. So people got the Immaculate Conception wrong. And most men and women who have achieved greatness always have to go back to their mother. It's not to say that the father is not important. He's very, very important. But if you understand the vehicle that you came in was a blessed vehicle, you would have another veneration for the female. That's why more than 10 years ago, I did a treatment on the confession of Adam and the acquittal of Eve. For 6,000 years, we've been blaming women for the fall of man, rather than man accepting the responsibility for his self-deception of himself by not being obedient to the instructions given to him. But that's another story. But I want to say, I start with her, my mother.
And her name?
Mary, interesting.
Okay.
And in Hebrew, Miriam, the mother of Jesus, the mother of the Messiah, the mother of the Savior. So I had a mother that brought birth of man with a spirit to be a savior for his God and his people.
Fighter.
A freedom fighter to this day.
LL Cool J
Yes.
had the song Mama Said,
Yeah.
Knock You Out.
Yeah.
So you bringing some of that.
And Mama said,
there.
bring you out. And I'm saying Mama told me to go bring them out.
Some other inspirations as a freedom fighter.
A man named L.A. Bryant, who later became Prince Shaliach, who told me in no uncertain terms of my greatness that he saw in me at 28 years old, that I would be greater than I could imagine. And I said, no, I can't be greater than you. He said, shut up, I know what I'm talking about. I'm not the one, but I know the one. And I trusted that he knew what I didn't know about myself in terms of what was inside of me spiritually, because he was that kind of a man that could discern. And in fact, he was called the prophet, Prophet L.A. Bryant.
Tall tree.
Yeah, he was called Prophet L.A. Bryant. So, and then needless to say, Ben-Ami, who had the courage to hear a voice tell him it's time to leave America and return back to the promised land. So I asked him, when I first met him, how do you know you're right? He said, because we're doing it. And that made all the sense in the world to me. He didn't need to say anything else, because I knew that you can't do anything except you've made up your mind to do it. And there ain't nothing that anybody can do to stop you from doing it. Well, when I heard it, I let that seed grow in me and begin to build the confidence and the intellect and the strength to do it. And so that's why today I endure and persevere to continue to the destiny of all of God's people. Black, white, as Dr. King said, is back in harmony with the creative universe, so that life is back on this planet again.
The Exodus we spoke of.
Yes.
1968,
Yes,
69
67, 68.
coming out.
Coming out of America then in 68,
And 63,
Yeah.
the same year of Dr. King's speech,
Yes.
you all are in the Beta, but you weren't part of a Beta
No.
with Prince Jaliak at that time.
No, and he wasn't part of a beta either. He had been called out of the Church of God in Christ in the 50s to begin to understand he was a Hebrew. And he didn't know how to deal with that, except he said, I instantly began to understand the Bible. And so I trusted that God was doing something with me, because I came out of a religious-based group of people who believed that they could speak to God in tongues.
So, a great churning in the midst of our people in the 60s
Yes,
that produced an exodus.
yes, sir.
Okay. Will there be another exodus?
Absolutely. In fact, it's in the making right now, because prophetically, for those of us who are watchers of time and seasons, have already seen what the Mayans predicted, that old world came to an end, meaning that the world of satanic influence no longer has dominion on this planet, but it's being moved towards justice, truth, mercy, and love. See, the world, as the song used to say, what the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's just not enough people thinking about it and doing it. So the shift, and we're not talking about a romantic love, it's a love for
Humanity.
God and
God,
humanity.
okay. Yeah.
And it's a love for justice, a love for truth.
Family.
Family. This is the love that we're talking about. We're not talking about a romantic love, but that's in its proper place is perfect too. But we're also talking about love of the creation, the birds, the bees, the flocks. The earth moans and groans, waiting the righteous expectations of the sons and daughters of the living God.
To be caretakers.
The caretakers of the planet again.
Take us with the history going parallel between, because you were there,
Yes.
in Africa, because we spoke of the other events with Malcolm moving, and prior to his assassination, he was moving throughout Africa,
Yes.
and you started to move throughout Africa.
Yes.
So take us through the timeline and the development of the great independence, African independence in the early 60s.
Well, let's
And
start before
the
that.
development of the kingdom, the community going at the same time.
Let's start before that. Let's start in the turn of the century, when a group of African men and women started a Pan-African Conference and began to call the strong men and women of spirit together and say, we need to be free. And by 1957, Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, became that first independent nation on the continent from the beginning of the colonization, since the beginning of the colonization period. And then by 1963, many of the nations had begun. And so by the time 1975, I was attending what was called the 6th Pan-African Conference in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And president of Tanzania at that time was Dr. Julius Nyerere, who came on the stage and said to the audience and to the world that this would be the last Pan-African conference, because the African nations were now gaining their independence and all of Africa would ultimately be free, which ended in 1994 with South Africa falling and becoming the last nation on the continent.
Power to define,
Yes.
Self-determination again.
Self-determination. And so when I went to the conference in 1975, it was 300 delegates from America, the who's who of Black America, and they would not let them register at the conference because they did not, quote, represent a nation. They were just citizens in America but had no power in America to determine their destiny or anybody else's. But when I went there and registered as the original African Hebrew Israelite nation of Jerusalem, as the ambassador for that little small nation in southern Judea, nation in Judea, I received credentials and was elevated. And then at that conference, I met the current, at that time, ambassador from Liberia, who's the son of the president, A.B. Talbot, invited me to Liberia to meet his father and introduced me to his father and his cabinet as the men and women in Israel from Africa, African Americans who are in Israel. They will be to Africa what the Vatican is to Europe. That is, they will guide us back to the true and living God. And that for me confirmed that I was not chasing rainbows.
What happened with the American representatives?
They just stayed there. 2 of them were sent as observers. The rest of them just could not attend the conference.
So, in the capacity as I want to make the distinction clear between an observer in a conference such as that and someone who was fully credentialed as you were.
You could vote on the rules, regulations, and the issues that were brought before the conference. The observer just could stay there and watch, like watching a sports event.
Fly on the wall.
Yes, sir.
Israel timeline.
Timeline, Israel, 1970, we go into Israel from...
Do me a favor, tie in when you're talking in Israel. A lot of times when the Israelites left in late 60s, there's not a lot of treatment for the Israelites that were here, coming out of the the late 19th century, so on and so forth. So speak to some of that and your involvement within those communities.
It really was
going
a lot.
into Israel.
It really was a lot, but because nobody thought of themselves as Israelites, it was just a small group of people that followed it. For instance, the Church of God in Christ, built by Bishop Mason, he originally was talking about the children of Israel were people who came from the vision that he got, that they were the children of Israel. And it later morphed into the Church of God in Christ. Also, the black Jews of Harlem, under Rabbi Matthew Wentworth Matthews, who was the proponent of blacks being Jews on the East Coast. Otley's book on the black Jews of Harlem. There's a lot of writings out, and when you begin to look at Mandela's autobiography,
Yeah.
you'll find out that one of the things that stood out in his book was that one of the first massacres took place of the Israelite community in South Africa. Yes, the Bohol. So there's a lot of information out there, but because our people had their eyes wide shut, they could not see, and their ears were closed, they could not hear truth, because they had been cut off from truth.
So, as you're going to tell us about what took place in Israel
Yes.
with you all, also kind of tie in, are those Israelite communities that you spoke of still existent? What happened with them? Are you in touch with them? Where does that sit now?
I think that we'll take a break, and then we'll talk about that on the other side of the break.
Excellent.
Thank you, Cliff.